Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 818, August the 10th, 1987. In case you didn't hear the broadcast last week, I announced that at the end of September 28th, 1987, with broadcast number 825, I'm going to discontinue the tape cassettes that go out by subscription or that are played on other radio stations and limit my broadcasting to 2 hours a week on Kazoo. That will be 2 hours of talk show. The format will be to take 10 or 20 of the most important stories of the week, run them down with you, similar to the way I do with World Watchers, and then take calls pertaining to those or for information that you have to share, on these matters. Now, David Emery from the Bay Area, who has programs on KKUP and KFJC, has come up with a very ingenious idea. And for those who subscribe that didn't get the tapes a long time ago, I might suggest this to you. He's going to put on KKUP and KFJC each week for just 1 hour on each station the broadcast that I did starting in October 1980. That was the time just before Ronald Reagan won the election from Jimmy Carter. And it would be very wonderful for you to, if you don't have these tapes, to subscribe to those monthly, the 1980 tapes, and then compare the news and watch the current news and listen to the background that I had 8 years ago. And then it develops into the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, the hostages coming home from Iran, and Reagan was shot in March, the Pope was shot in May, and events were flowing very rapidly and continuously once Ronald Reagan was sworn in with oath of office. I got out the sheet that accompanies the broadcast for October the 5th, 1980, 7 years ago, broadcast number 461, and I wish I had 3 lifetimes to play back what I had on the air. And I think for those of you that enjoy World Watchers, if you get the back broadcast, it would be just as informational and just as instructive and even very interesting to listen to these broadcasts and subscribe to those. And all the back broadcasts from March 1977 are available for those who want them. That time period 7 years ago, before Reagan won the election against Jimmy Carter, I discussed the Paul Laxalt file, the links of Paul Laxalt to the user organization, of course, in Las Vegas and elsewhere, and with the Christic Institute filing their suit regarding the Iran Contra characters. It was Robert Mayu from the user organization that worked closely with Laxalt who hired Santos Traficanta and a group of assassins that later went all over the world, Southeast Asia, Chile, Middle East, Iran, and in the United States worked with the Bay of Pigs operations, and then some of them participated in the Kennedy assassination. So I was talking about Howard Hughes organization, and Mayu, coming from the Hughes organization, hired Traficante, and it's very important to get those roots 7 years ago that you're seeing in the news now. I also did on that broadcast information about Carlos the Jackal being saved by the CIA, and talked about arms merchants Frank Turple and George Kokula, who were arrested in New York in 1980. And then, of course, they linked up then to Edwin Wilson, partners with Edwin Wilson and Eric von Marburg and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins. I was talking about these men in 1980, and that might be of interest to you. I should hope it would be. And then I discussed how in Munich, West Germany, there was a mass murder. One man was blamed for the explosion. The others got away. How justice is served when the patsy is wiped out, the killers flee. Then on that same broadcast in 1980, I talked about the Somoza killers, the very controversial Anastasia Somoza, who was kicked out of Nicaragua in 1979, how he was murdered in 1980. Nobody found the people that murdered him in the group. The CIA was blamed for it. A Uyghur Urizum was shot by the police, sort of a Lee Harvey Oswald situation. They were not allowed to identify the body. And Somoza and Nicaragua are, of course, in the news ever since the moment that Reagan was inaugurated, and more now than ever. Also, I talked about the man who shot at Vernon, Jordan. He survived the shooting, but I was talking about Joseph Franklin from Mobile, Alabama, and then later I met Larry Flint and put together, years before I met him, this man had also been responsible for shooting Larry Flynt, trying to kill him and paralyzing him. And this person I was describing, this was in October of 1980. Also, I described what was supposed to be a suicide in 1980 in Brazil of Gustav Franz Wagner, the head of a concentration camp in Poland, who lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil, whose photograph was taken at a birthday party with Adolf Hitler in Rio de Janeiro. And since then, he had lived in Sao Paulo. The party was in Rio de Janeiro, near there. And since that time period, we found that Joseph Mengele lived in that area, and also the newspapers in Nicaragua and the CNN News had a story of Hitler dying in Mendoza, Argentina, just this past February. I'll have to update that for you. Or he died in January. It was on the news in February, and I want to update the Hitler death in Mendoza, Argentina. So those are the things I was talking about 8 years ago, and with a very good imagination. If you listen to that, you can visualize those days, then put yourself right here in 1987, in October 87, and watch the news today and relate it to the very important things I was talking about 7 years ago. The London Times had a story this past week, Peace Prize proposed for kidnapped Israeli. Mordecai Vanunu, the nuclear technician waiting trial in Israel for treason for revealing his country's nuclear secrets, has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I believe that the reason he's so isolated, and I've done broadcasts on that, is because he revealed Israel's neutron bomb to the New York Times, and that's one of the first articles I want to write about, if not the first, when I discontinue the formal series part of this broadcast and spend more time writing. The London Times said the British-based Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation has nominated Vanunu for the prize for his outstanding contribution to world peace when he revealed the secrets of the Israeli bomb factory that ended decades of speculation about the nuclearization of the Middle East conflict. Vanunu was kidnapped in London by the Mossad. He was taken out of London to Rome and then to Israel, and the support for his nomination, which is probably a long shot, comes from 36 members of the parliament. Last week, Graham Greene, Piers, Paul Reed, and Oberon Waugh signed a letter to the Times asking for Vanunu's immediate release. It's unbelievable that he's living under these conditions and that people have not voiced a serious protest against the outrage. Of course, I have, and I should be doing more every week, but he is isolated in a cell. It's permanently lit. He's under constant video surveillance, and the authorities refuse to let him see his girlfriend or a priest, and his brother Meyer has been in Great Britain speaking, and he's coming to this country, and he's accused the European leaders of ignoring his brother's illegal kidnapping and says they're trying to break him down psychologically. I think there would be more support if these people connected the atomic bomb to the neutron bomb, but it's hard to get a new idea even into a young head, and I've had trouble. I've contacted these people who are concerned about Vanunu, and they're not at all interested in the fact that he told the London Times, and it was printed in the London Times, about the capability of Israel to have the neutron bomb, which I believe was tested for the United States and for themselves in Cameroon last year. The Pope is coming to Monterey. The budget has been published in all the West Coast papers at least. It's going to cost us $307,692 per hour. The Monterey County will put up those dollars for the Pope. A friend of mine was over this morning and had on a shirt called Monterey Pope, and he's playing a guitar, and he's got a cross with an earring. I'm getting one of the shirts. I collect these shirts. If any of you want them, they're $10. Write to me, and I will send you a sweatshirt. Let me know what size, saying Monterey Pope playing the guitar. The Los Angeles Times had a brief article about Rear Admiral John Poindexter, who's supposed to have the most amazing memory recall in the White House or in the military service, and they added up that he said, I can't recall 184 times before the Iran-Contra hearing in 2 days, which topped Robert Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, whose memory only failed him 150 occasions. The Associated Press carried a story this past week that North is being investigated very closely for criminal activities, and Mr. Lawrence Walsh was at the American Bar Association convention in San Francisco, and he said the prominence of a person or the popularity of a person has nothing to do with a criminal case, because any more than an unpopular person should be prosecuted. The evidence will stick for itself, and one of the things that the special prosecutor is challenging North about is that he refuses to obey a grand jury subpoena for a sample of his handwriting. Much of the case is under seal, but the court records indicate that North was held in contempt of court May the 8th by Robinson, and they believe that some documents that were located evidently had his handwriting on them. They were not supposed to be his handwriting. Goodness knows what they were, but this American hero, it would be very fitting to see him be charged with forgery, among other things, and he's fighting this in court. There's a story in the San Francisco Examiner, July 28th, AIDS wiping out Indians, the Navajo physician warns. And this is one of the saddest stories and most horrible things that I've read in a long, long time. AIDS is spreading rapidly through the American Indian tribes. It could wipe out the smaller reservations, partly because the culture tolerates bisexual relationships. A doctor in Seattle, speaking for the Navajo Nation Department of Health, says that AIDS could be passed on to children at birth, killing them at age 2. It could wipe out entire tribes. It can saturate all the childbearing members of a tribe. This reminds me of the King Alfred plan that I obtained from somebody who got it from, it doesn't tell me who, but it's from the National Security Council, that complained about the containers that keep reproducing blacks, and that you would have to gas the containers, the reproduction elements, as well as the living people, to end the race once and for all. In this case, the childbearing members of the tribe would be saturated with AIDS, and this is a story about wiping out maybe an entire Navajo or other smaller tribes of Indian tribes in the United States. The article says the Navajos did not have a reported case of AIDS as of last December. Now it's July, and there are 39 cases that have been reported. It's bad all over the world, because I believe, and play back this broadcast 7 years from now, it is possible to wipe out every black person in Africa and every Indian in the United States just as, say, first targets. Reagan had a slip of tongue in the newspaper last week. Reported in the UPI, Reagan addressed a gathering of law enforcement officers yesterday. Speaking of the Crime Control Act, Reagan noted that it, in quotes, eliminated parole and reduced the amount of time off for good behavior that could be granted a president. Then all of a sudden the audience realized that the word should have been prisoner instead of president, and the president would be off for good behavior, and that was some interesting slip of the tongue. Another article, July 23rd, in the Washington Post, Iran data sought from the Justice Department besides the signature or handwriting of Ali North. And the article says Lawrence Walsh has made a comprehensive request for information covering the entire Justice Department, including the FBI. And I want to do some more details on William Webster in the future, but right now they're looking into William Webster, including Edwin Meese and the now Webster's director of the CIA, and Oliver B. Revelle. And that's a big name in this case that I have not dwelled upon because there's so much material. He was a man who sat with the National Security Council. He was directly under William Webster, and he was very much a part of the entire Iran-Contra operation from beginning to end. In these times, had a story August the 5th, CIA agent's lawyer moves for secrecy in Christic Institute. And this article mentions Mr. Revelle in a very interesting point, and I want to throw this out to you, and I'll do more on it in the weeks to come. The article is about Lieutenant retired General Richard Secord, who hired Glenn Robinette to discredit the Christic Institute. You heard Robinette talking before the Iran-Contra hearing. He built the security fence for the Oliver North family. He was from the CIA, and he was hired by Secord to discredit the Christic group in their lawsuit. The Christic Institute claims that North, Secord, Hakeem, Robert Owen, Theodore Shackley, Adolfo Calero, and 24 others built a network. In 1984, they bombed Eden Pastora, killed 8 people. The civil suit is brought on by RICO, R-I-C-O, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, with allegations they ran a cocaine smuggling operation out of Costa Rica and were going to assassinate the U.S. ambassador to provoke intervention in Nicaragua. I've had a lot about the Christic Institute on the air. But this article goes into Robinette, this controversial, he's not controversial yet, but the article says he is a very important person, and I know he is. And it says Robinette's deposition could be explosive because of his relationship to General Secord from the Stanford Technology Training Group, from Oliver North from the Defense Department and the National Security Council, and Oliver Buck Revelle, the senior FBI representative on the NSC's Operation Subgroup on Terrorism. Now, that Operation Subgroup on Terrorism is really translated means create enough terrorism for the excuse for a police state, similar to the P2 that Francesco Pazienza and Alexander Haig and Michael Ledeen were part of. Then the article continues, according to an FBI report released by the Iran-Contra Select Committee, North met with Robinette on July 17, 1986, for the purpose, and this is a former CIA man meeting with North who built his fence, to discuss a former Contra supporter by the name of Jack Terrell, who was talking publicly about North's involvement in a group that was supplying the Contras and smuggling cocaine. Now, the Christic Institute filed their suit May 29, 1986, and keep these dates in their chronological order. The FBI and we're meeting with Robinette and North on July 17th to talk about the North connections to the cocaine Costa Rica activities, the deaths down there, and so forth. And this was 6 weeks after the Christic Institute filed their lawsuit, and they were being interviewed. North asked Mr. Robinette, formerly of the CIA, to meet with the FBI about Jack Terrell. Later that evening, Robinette met with the FBI. The CIA man who helped North with his security, who was paid to discredit the Christic Institute, was meeting with the FBI with Oliver Buck Revelle. July 22, 1986, that's 5 days later, the FBI report, they made a report, outlines the discussion between Oliver North and two FBI agents about the former Contra, Mr. Terrell, although it does not explain the FBI's reason for investigating Terrell. He had surfaced and was now helping the Christic Institute and talking about these matters, and they had filed a case in the court in May of 86 that the Iran-Contra group completely ignored, and these dates prove that it was in their time limit to investigate these matters. These same two agents interrogated Terrell in August 86, that's 1 month later, ostensibly about the threat on the life of the president in July of last year, which means in July 1986, there was the possibility of a threat on the president of the United States, and they were asking Terrell about it, and Terrell worked with Secord and Singlaub and Shackley and Kleins and North and Poindexter and that group from the NSC with Adolfo Calero. Now, there is the very strong possibility that when the Christic Institute filed their lawsuit in May of 1983, May 29, 1983, it might have prevented the murder of Ronald Reagan, because the people involved in that murder, who they're interviewing, Mr. Terrell's gang, would be identified with the murder of the President of the United States. Now, a parallel of the same team took place exactly in 1972 in Los Angeles and in Washington, where there were plans to kill Richard Nixon and make Spiro Agnew, with his fascist connections, President of the United States. It involved Squad 19. I wrote about it in my article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And in the next year, 1983, wrote the Senate Select Committee as part of the cover-up. And there was money transacted being sent down to Miami to Frank Sturgis, the gentleman named in the Christic Institute affidavit, being hired by Santos Traffic Canada, the same people. And McCord worked with a 16-man emergency unit in 1972, the same one that Mr. Gufrida went to the War College and prepared in 1970. Then he moved to the head of FEMA, he moved to California in 1971, and that's the time when Squad 19 was set up to kill Richard Nixon. He worked with Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan, who had a role with people involved in the murder of John Kennedy and then Robert Kennedy. And the assassination attempt of Nixon, in those days had to be put off because the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. And I wrote about that in my articles on Watergate, why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped, and so forth. And the money that was in the banks of Bernard Barker and E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and that gang was the money also used to create the riots at the convention in Miami in 1972 that didn't happen because the money linked to the people that were going to kill Richard Nixon. I had this detailed through the years, the Meese, the Reagan connections, the Squad 19, and so forth. So it's very possible that with the FBI interviewing Mr. Terrell, these agents, they were discussing a threat on the life of the president in 1986. Why would they be talking about him? Now, in August 1986, in World Watchers, number 767, August the 18th, 1986, I was talking on the air about the lawsuit filed by the Christic Institute on World Watchers, and I know these shows are monitored or whatever, and listened. We're around Fort Ord here, and the Hunter Liggett, the laser station, the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, the Presidio, the Language School for Spies, the Navy Postgraduate School, the Intercommunication Satellite of Kashawa. On this peninsula, we have 7 major military installations, and I know that somebody out of that gang gets these tapes or listens. And besides that, the Christic Institute filed their suit in May in Miami, and were naming the very people in the White House that worked with Oliver North and Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, John Singlaub, that were running their Central American operations and their worldwide network over in Iran earlier, and in Southeast Asia before that. So this article goes into the interest of Robinette, and it's from In These Times. It says 7 people attended the interrogation of Mr. Terrell, Jack Terrell. Only 2 FBI identified themselves, and he noted the session was more like political debriefing than an investigation. Now, that's the way the General Accounting Office came to my house and talked about Fritz Kramer, and from the National Security Council, a former plans officer of the Pentagon. They didn't even put his name in the report. They didn't want to get facts. It was not an investigation. It was a political debriefing to see what I said or no. But it's interesting that this In These Times says the possibility of the FBI participation in the attempt to discredit the lawsuit is raised July 19th, 1986, in the entry of the name of Assistant FBI Director Revelle in Robinette's appointment calendar 2 days after North met with Robinette. And then this article continues, Revelle's involvement, the FBI, with Robinette was not discussed during the open Iran-Contra hearings, but Christic attorney Lanny Sinkin didn't know who Robinette talked to. This wasn't brought up. Who he paid off to discredit their institute, what he got, or what other activities he was engaged in. So I think the chronology here of these people is very interesting, because the coup that didn't happen in March 81, where George Bush would be president and Alexander Haig would be in charge, didn't happen, but it was very easy, if they had remained in power and there had been no Christic Institute suit filed, to maybe get away with a murder or a coup or do away with Reagan. But it could be that the filing of that suit, May 29th, triggered the FBI in July and then in August, and they pinned down a man who had left the gang, Jack Terrell, and asked him about a threat on the life of the president. And, of course, that threat could be very real. And now our president is going to Santa Barbara, and he's going to take about 25 days off. And as I mentioned last week on World Watchers, it was Frank Carlucci, the current National Security Director, who at that time was Deputy Director in the Defense Department, who wrote, "Normally a state of martial law will be proclaimed by the President. However, in the absence of such action by the President, a senior military commander may impose martial law." Now, at the time Reagan was shot in March 81, there was a big battle going on in Washington, D.C., Bush, the former CIA director, Vice President George Bush, against Alexander Haig, who was Secretary of State. And Bush, as Vice President, wanted to be in charge of domestic control of all domestic areas if there were a martial law emergency taking place, and Haig wanted to be in charge of it as Secretary of State, taking the domestic as well as the overseas assignment. And Bush won out. And Bush has stayed thick with those very people in El Salvador and the ones arming the Contras, with the people linked down to Klaus Barbie in Bolivia. And Bush has been isolated from the entire Iran-Contra story, and I believe his roots go much deeper as former CIA director to these people, and he did win out over Haig as in charge of the domestic area in case of an emergency. I saw a movie last week that I hope it comes to your town. It's a small movie, low production cost. It would be at one of the theaters where you have foreign movies, if you're lucky enough to be in a city that has them. And it's called On the Border, directed by Peter Torbjörnsson, made in 1986. It took 2 years to film. It's a Swedish director who spent several years in Nicaragua and El Salvador talking to people about the war in their countries. He On the Border, takes the director and the cameraman to the border of El Salvador and flights to Honduras, the Nicaragua border, Honduras, the Nicaraguans with the Costa Ricans, the Hondurans trying to get to Mexico, from Mexico to the United States, and it shows various family members, a very personal account of experiences and people being killed and some even surviving and being returned back from the United States to El Salvador. But in the movie, there's an interesting shot almost towards the end of the movie, and it showed a place in Honduras where the CIA and the United States government were having their meetings or war councils, and Daniel Ortega was there. Maybe they had gone to Nicaragua, as a matter of fact. And in the scene, there's a flash of Henry Kissinger with Oliver North. And I almost fell off my chair seeing the two together. But Henry Kissinger was handed the Central American policy when Senator Henry Jackson was dead. He died one night after Larry McDonald was killed in the Korean airline crash. Very quietly, Henry Jackson had a heart attack. The entire Jackson machinery went to the National Security Council and to the Defense Department, like Richard Pearl and Jackson's protégés, and Henry Kissinger then entered formally the Central American policies for Ronald Reagan. He had not touched Kissinger. He had his co-partner Haig as Secretary of State the first 2 years, but in comes Henry Kissinger, mounting his white horse and taking over Central American policy, and with him in the Central American policy bloodbath operations was Oliver North, who traveled with him. But this was a chance to see the two together in a movie. So if you go to a foreign movie theater where these movies are shown, ask for On the Border. It was filmed in 1986, and see Oliver North with Henry Kissinger. And I want to do more on the National Security Council and the KAL pretty soon. I've mentioned that before. Well, the secret team isn't secret if you know them. The Iran-Contra hearings are over. On CBS Sunday morning, Charles Kuralt had three people talking about the National Security Council and what was wrong with Ronald Reagan. One was Henry Kissinger, one was the big new Brzezinski, and the other one was a gentleman from England. One from Germany, one from Poland, and one from England, who literally run our country, stand by the wayside and watch these other people get sloughed off if they get caught in the act, and the elder statesmen stay there on every channel of television and in the printed press. The Washington Post had an article July 21st, 1987, a full half-page, The Iran-Contra Hearings, the 10th week of testimony. Former security aides suggest Poindexter overstepped his authority, and the experts, of course, are Brent Scowcroft, president of Kissinger Associates, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Another long article in the Wall Street Journal, the member of the secret team comes right out in front. It's Michael Ledeen, August the 10th, the day how the Iran initiative went wrong. And all of a sudden, he's an expert talking about the Iran initiative instead of going to jail. He's president of ISI Enterprises, a consulting firm in Chevy Chase, and the enterprise that he has is part of the enterprise of Secord, Hakim, Shackley, Kleins, Eric von Marburg, and Kissinger, and Fritz Kramer, and Michael Ledeen is a part of that, and a protege of Robert McFarland, and close to Poindexter. And now he has a quarter of a page, and he will be continuously writing instead of wearing the striped suit, of a prisoner of the Wall Street Journal, how the Iran initiative went wrong. He gets to be published and recognized in those terms. I'll just have one item, a couple to mention before I go on to the new appointment of FBI Director We'll take a 1-minute break now before I get onto that subject. I have a couple more news items to update with you. This is Mae Brussell, and we'll be back together in about 1 minute. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watches, program number 818, August the 10th, 1987. I apologize for running through these articles so quickly. I'm not even touching the contents of them. There is so much news. I just want to mention to you that they're out there and how these people can be visualized. Scowcroft, Kissinger, Haig, continuously Brzezinski, staying away from the very people that they set up in the NSC. And they have a fail-safe, just as they did at the time of Watergate with all the crimes. Henry Kissinger certainly should have been charged with the wiretapping, forming the White House plumbers, the COINTEL program, Operation Chaos, the Cambodia bombing, but instead he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. Wall Street Journal had a story July 28th last week. Peter Drucker wins the devotion of top firms with eclectic counsel. He's 77 years old. He ranks number 1 in his field, and he has a passion for the Japanese. Peter Drucker brought Fritz Kramer to this country. This article is literally 1/4 of a page or more from the Wall Street Journal, telling about his devotion and fixation about the Japanese government and the Japanese people. He is the man who brought Fritz Kramer to this country, and he is the one helping these big corporations now buy bigger corporations, and corporations doing their production overseas where the labor is cheaper and we import it to this country. He's a very important figure, Peter Drucker, in the financial world, and I'll share some of this article with you. But while Kissinger and Kramer and Kissinger and Brzezinski and Scowcroft are on the television, all those major channels, Drucker takes a backseat, except going from one boardroom of one corporation to the other. He is very important to the corporations, and he is in the news. He writes constantly, and he is one of the great manipulators of this not-so-secret team, or otherwise you could describe as the enterprise, like Ledeen calls his company, or you can call it the team that Fawn Hall talks about, or you can call it the Odessa, which I prefer to call it. And again, Drucker's from Frankfurt, Germany, the same location as Fritz Kramer. A story in the Wall Street Journal of a very important person, speaking of Germany, David Fisher, a close aide in the White House who arranged Contra activities, who worked with Carl Spitz-Channel, and Richard Miller, the publicist. The article's titled, "Former Aide Said the White House Knew," this is Donald Reagan, knew he was being paid, Fisher was being paid for pro-Contra activities. I'm not going into the Fisher story now, except he challenges Donald Reagan when he said he was unaware of what Fisher was doing. And Fisher says the money I raised, he himself was not aware that it was going to the insurgents, that it was going to the military operations, that he wanted to provide the money, this conservative group, to build contacts in Europe and projects planned in West Germany. Now, Spitz-Channel took over Western Goals, which has offices in Munich, Germany. The woman who appointed all these people into these White House jobs was Helene von Dahm from Austria, who's back there now. Ronald Reagan rewarded her for being ambassador to Austria after she served 8 years with Ronald Reagan in California as translator for Otto von Bolschwing's TCI Corporation. This is a subsidiary. Later, Albert Hakim von Bolschwing from the Waffen-SS, very much a Nazi in terms of taking the wealth, the homes, the belongings of Jews, having them exterminated. He was head of the Romanian Iron Guard, and then in the Netherlands, he came to California and worked with his network. And the offices in Germany are a very strong factor to the Western Goals that Spitz-Channel took over after Larry McDonald was killed in the Korean airline, and also to the group of people that worked in Southeast Asia, Iran, Chile, Central America, that are part of the Christic Institute lawsuit. Many of them mentioned as these are the workers of the secret team. The managers higher up are the Druckers, Kramer, Kissinger, Scowcroft, Haig type of people. And those down below can be slapped on the wrist once in a while. But Fisher talks about his plans in West Germany. And one of the plans he had was to establish himself in Europe and raise funds to build a lighted torch on the Berlin Wall. And, of course, they had the president over honoring the graves at Bitburg of the Waffen SS and going back to the wall for a second time this year. When I talk about characters from the past World War II, there are many people who do not understand that active minds do not end at a certain age, and that many of these social activists of the far right don't die until a ripe old age. There was an article in the Washington Times this week. Intrepid says the title, Spy Chief Was a Mole. It comes from Bermuda and is about Sir William Stevenson, the legendary British intelligence leader. And I talked about him last week on World Watchers, program 817, how the taking of America, the giving of America began when William Stevenson moved to Rockefeller Center. Then he set up headquarters in Montego Bay down in the Caribbean. He lives in Bermuda. He was commenting upon a new book that's been written about the British spy system. It's called Spy Catcher, very controversial, and he does agree that Mr. Hollis, or Roger Hollis, was a double agent. He was a bad egg if there ever was one. The point about Hollis isn't important right now, or the book Spy Catcher for the moment. It is important to all of us, and we should read it. But the interesting part for me is that Sir William Stevenson is 91. He's active. He writes material for the Royal Gazette in Bermuda, and he mingled the British intelligence with the Americans starting in 1943, which headed up operations such as Permindex with the assassination teams that killed heads of states all over the world. So when I refer to Sir William Stevenson and Intrepid, don't think he's dead and long gone, because he isn't. Another man of this kind of ilk and operation just died a couple of months ago, and I haven't had a chance to put it on the air. Jacob Merrill Kaplan. He died at the age of 95. That's a nice, ripe age. Sir William Stevenson, is 92. The obituary I have says Jacob Merrill Kaplan, a merchant and self-made financier, became one of New York's foremost philanthropists. He died Saturday at the age of 95. He made his wealth from Welch grape juice, which he organized, owned, and headed from 1940 to 1958. In 1947, he established his philanthropy, the J.M. Kaplan Fund. And 1947 was the year the CIA was formed. It was the year the National Security Council was formed. And the J.M. Kaplan Fund, the obituary said, through his inventiveness and diversity, was known for, they called it inventiveness or diversity. It actually was a part of the CIA foundations that was funding money for the liberals, the type of people that worked with liberal radio stations, liberal newspapers, black activists, civil rights. The Kaplan Fund was used to infiltrate through the operation that made it appear that people were liberal or leftist, the CIA money to control those operations until the parties became really neutralized and there was no more voice or strong opposition, because the Kaplan Fund had taken over the labor movement and the civil rights movement, the blacks and the artists, and the CIA funds were channeled through them. The obituary says this fund won recognition as a consistent supporter of the arts, of civil liberties, of human rights, of the NAACP legal defense, and the education funds, and its donations range from seed money to encourage musicians to commission works for composers and for helping the New York Botanical Garden be saved from extinction, a grove of virgin hemlock. So these organizations had their funding, their seed money, or their support, a good part of it, from the J.M. Kaplan Fund, which was a CIA foundation. I'll do more on that later if you want, and some of the groups that they supported. But one more news item I want to share with you before we get to the new FBI director. A wedding announcement was in the newspaper this past weekend. I'm sure all of you, or many of you, saw it. It's one wedding I'd like to go to. I usually turn down invitations and don't particularly enjoy going to weddings that much. But this is one that I feel slighted I wasn't invited, and maybe I can go to a reception party. The newspaper said Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi married the 25-year-old daughter of Saudi Arabian oil magnate Adnan Khashoggi. Milan's Corriere della Sera announced that it's highly reliable that Gaddafi wed Nabila Khashoggi. As a gift to the bride's family, Gaddafi has signed a contract to sell Khashoggi Libyan crude oil below the market price. Now, Khashoggi is related to his father was a physician to the Saudi family. He's very much and very close to the Saudi Arabian oil. I don't know why Khashoggi would need a deal to buy Libyan oil, but this is an interesting story, and the implications are just amazing because of the relationship of Khashoggi to Michael Ledeen, to Cyrus Hashemi, to Albert Hakim, to the CIA. He was paid by the Lockheed Corporation and funded by the CIA for years. He had a bad streak of luck at the time of the Iran-Contra affair, and the Sultan of Brunei bought his yacht for $50 million. And also he was on the board of a bank that was in part of the Furmark operation that were going to blackmail William Casey and this administration. It was a bank in Monte Carlo, and a British gentleman named Rowland bought the entire bank in Monte Carlo, and all the papers accorded with it. These elements of the Khashoggi, Hakim, Furmark, Casey, Cyrus Hashemi, who was murdered, Cyrus Hashemi, all of these interconnecting links of Iran-Contra are very important to the entire fabric that was never brought up at these hearings. The Israeli, the Saudi Arabian, the secret team, the Odessa network, the enterprise. But this marriage it is an interesting one. I'd love to see those two families together, but I don't think they'll invite me. Now, I wanted to get immediately onto the appointment of the new FBI director. I'll do as much as I can this with the remaining time because I had to update those other stories or wanted to do it with you, and then we'll get back to matters later. Dick Cheney from Wyoming is a very staunch conservative Republican. He was on the Select Committee of the Iran-Contra hearings. Formerly, he was the White House Chief of Staff under President Ford. As I say, one of the staunchest conservatives with very close ties to the Reagan administration. And his wife, Lynn Cheney, is chairman of the National Endowment for Humanities. So you know what direction that's going to go. But I want to give you a quote of Gerald Ford, whose Chief of Staff, Mr. Dick Cheney, worked for him. This was from 1975 when the Rockefeller Commission was putting out their report on investigations of murders, including the one of John Kennedy, the former President of the United States. And on that Rockefeller Commission was Ronald Reagan, appointed on this commission. And Gerald Ford and Mr. Cheney had this to say. This is from the Star and Times of June the 10th, 1975, Kansas City. President Ford said that material gathered by the Rockefeller Commission on political assassination plots by the CIA would be kept secret because it would not be in the national interest to divulge it. The President of the United States is elected in 1960. He's shot in 1963. A team set up by Robert Mayu of the CIA, the FBI, and the user organization hires Santos Trafficante, whose agents were with John Kennedy and this one Judith Exner in and out of the White House, and these men were wanted, or not wanted, but known as the world's greatest drug traffickers. Santos Trafficante is named by Kung Sa in Burma, working with Theodore Shackley in drug traffic in Southeast Asia, and Trafficante and Carlos Marcello and John Rosselli worked with Mayu, and the assassination teams were protected and have direct links to persons that are being recognized in the news today. And Gerald Ford and Dick Cheney believed then that the CIA should keep assassination plots secret because it would not be in the best interest of it'd be in the national interest to divulge it. And our new FBI director has that same mind, so you can make sure if he has a 10-year term with William Webster, formerly the FBI, and the CIA for 10 years, it will be at least 10 years or till hell freezes over, till any of the assassination investigation ever comes to the light of day on John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Martin Luther King. Just those three. Now, the Monterey Herald had a story July 24th. Federal judge nominated for FBI director, and they pointed out that he's strongly backed by former Senator John Tower, Republican of Texas, who first recommended him for a U.S. attorney. Mr. Sessions is also having the approval of other Texas politicians, even a Democrat, such as Senator Lloyd Benston. Now, you remember that I did a broadcast, or many broadcasts through the years, on John Tower and his relationship to Lee and Marina Oswald coming into this country from the Soviet Union. I'll do a little bit more and update you and remind you of the role of John Tower in this particular operation. Also, the articles about Mr. Sessions, if you've been reading them, William Sessions, one from the Washington Post, July 24th, federal judge, this is about his being nominated, and the article says, Mr. Sessions, a Republican, was named U.S. Attorney by President Richard Nixon in 1971. This is at the time when the martial law plat was made. It had already been written up at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Mr. Giuffrida was in California with Reagan and Edwin Meese. But it said Nixon had appointed him, and this also was the time of the COINTEL program of domestic operation in the United States, and Operation Chaos run by the FBI, used by Ronald Reagan when he was governor. And the article says Sessions was then appointed for the federal bench. He was U.S. Attorney by Nixon. Federal bench appointed by Gerald Ford in 1974. Now, Gerald Ford was put on the Warren Commission when John Kennedy was killed. Nixon was in Dallas that same day and a few days prior to it. And Gerald Ford was an active member of the CIA and FBI while working on the Warren Commission and making those famous leaks that Ollie North complained about, or Richard Nixon compared about, where he was leaking to Time magazine the story of Oswald's diary, which turned out to never be proved as having been Lee Harvey Oswald's diary. William Sessions gained national attention, according to the Washington Post, when he presided over 2 trials stemming from the slaying of U.S. District Court Judge John H. Wood, Jr., known as Maximum John. Sessions is strongly backed, as I say, by these people like John Tower. Now, in the Hudson Valley Chronicle that I've quoted many times, published by David Wemple in July 77, David Wemple took the affidavit of Robert Byron Watson, who said that John Tower was part of the enterprise, the drug traffic and enterprise, that he worked with a Mr. Christ Cametches, Kametches, a cocaine smuggling operation that came out of El Paso, Texas, from South America. It was a cocaine distribution centered in Atlanta, Georgia. Cametches said that Bobby Jones, Lyndon Johnson's pal, was safe because he could keep large amounts of cocaine around, and he was safe in El Paso or wherever because the Drug Enforcement Agency was part of the drug problem. And Robert Byron said even Senator John Tower and Governor Dolph Briscoe worked for the association called the Enterprise with the Syndicate. The syndicate controls the entire state of Texas, just about. So this John Tower, mentioned in affidavits in 1977, recommends a judge who is going to be hearing the case of Judge Wood, who was killed allegedly for being hard on drug dealers. The murder of Judge Wood was very, very important. The role of John Tower in bringing Lee and Marina to this country, I updated this past March, program 795. If you want the tape, it's available. The link of Lee and Marina Oswald, and also the article of the Robert Byron Watson affidavit is available. I can make reprints if you want. I'm not anxious to do it, but I will. Some of you have that information. But Tower is behind Sessions. Sessions took the case of the murder of John Wood, and it's very important to study that case. Now, federal judge William Webster was from St. Louis, Missouri. Then he went on to become FBI director. He's now CIA director. Webster was the judge when he set up the Abscam operation, which sent a lot of preponderant Democratic congressmen to jail. Webster infiltrated the El Salvadorian refugees. He helped send many of them back to the death squads in El Salvador. Webster went from a judge in Missouri to the FBI director to the CIA director. James Earl Ray, in his new book, Tennessee Waltz, talks about the role of Judge Webster in framing him and trying to blame his brother for a bank robbery. And John Ray, the brother of James Earl Ray, now in a Tennessee jail, who wrote a book about his being framed, said his brother John went before Judge William Webster with a man named Ronald Goldenstein, and they were charged with robbing a bank. And the judge sent his brother to prison for 18 years. He got out. But James Earl Ray blames Judge Webster for framing his brother. Now, James Earl Ray in his book connects not only Judge Webster to the case of the assassination of Martin Luther King in the way that he intimidates and prosecutes and tries to put the pressure on the James Earl Ray family instead of the real assassins, and James Earl Ray connects Clyde Watts of Oklahoma to his case. Watts was a close friend of General Walker and was in the home of General Walker when Jack Ruby was there, and also G. Robert Blakey, the chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations with Chairman Louis Stokes, were looking into the murder of Martin Luther King, or were supposed to, and they covered up the tentacles to the assassination of Martin Luther King, the same Louis Stokes from the Iran-Contra Committee who's covered up so many of these conspiracies. A person named in James Earl Ray's new book, Tennessee Waltz, besides Clyde Watts and G. Robert Blakey, is Randolph Irwin Rosenson, and he was locked up for drug traffic, and Ray knew him. Rosenson's attorney in New Orleans, when he was arrested in 1966, was a man named G. Ray Gill. And I'm going into these details that pertain to Webster because Webster, as the FBI man in St. Louis, Missouri, was covering up the real tentacles of the conspiracy and trying to blame John Ray, the brother of James Earl Ray, hoping that the charges he gave John would rub off and they'd both keep looking guilty of various crimes. Rosenson, as I say, had an attorney in New Orleans named W. Gray Gill. And in 1962, 1 year before Kennedy was killed, G. Ray Gill hired David Ferry as his investigator, the one that Clay Shaw worked with in New Orleans, the one that Jim Garrison wanted for playing a role in the murder of John Kennedy. And Rosenson was working with G. Ray Gill that was his person attorney that he used, who was working with David Ferry. And Ferry was investigating for Gill, and they were investigating the deportation proceedings against Carlos Marcello. Robert Kennedy had sent him out of the country. The Kennedy administration was against crime boss Carlos Marcello, and Robert Kennedy was described as a person that Marcello wanted to do away with when he was Attorney General. He was in exile in Guatemala and came back. Marcello was released and flown back to the United States by David Ferry, who was doing investigative work for the attorney G. Ray Gill, who also represented Randolph Irwin Rosenson, a person whose name James Earl Ray had. Marcello stood trial in New Orleans for citizen falsification. He was acquitted. November 23rd, after Kennedy was killed in 1963, David Ferry got a call from the G. Ray Gill, the attorney and friend of David Ferry's, and Mr. Rosenson, whose name James Earl Ray had a few years later, saying that he was a suspect in the murder of John Kennedy. So David Ferry went to the New York police and told them that he was preoccupied helping attorney G. Ray Gill, and he was preparing a defense for Carlos Marcello citizenship. And I hope this isn't too confusing for you, but the Webster, who was FBI director, was a judge earlier. Now he's our CIA director, and all of this information was bypassed, the things that James Earl Ray knew, while they locked his brother in jail for 10 years, which didn't seem to serve much purpose and didn't prove that he did the bank robbery they said he did. Now, in 1980, John Ray was paroled from federal prison, and as I say, he blames the FBI and Judge Webster for sitting on the true information about the real story behind the Martin Luther King assassination. Now, the interesting aspects of this Mr. William Sessions becoming the FBI director is that he was in charge of the murder case of Judge Wood, who was listening to the narcotics traffic trial, and two were convicted. But a report came out, Jim Mars wrote in Dallas News-Tribune, June the 11th, 1982, an article titled, "Is Kennedy's Assassin Sitting in the Texas Jail?" And this article has to do with a man named Mr. Harrelson. Many of you know the name, Charles V. Harrelson, who claimed at the time that he was arrested for shooting and arranging the murder of Judge Wood that he was one of the men behind the murder of John Kennedy. And his face back in 1963 closely resembles one of the tramps. And the point is that William Sessions, the judge in the case, ignored Charles Harrelson, pays no attention to his claims that when he gets out, he'll blow the case on the Kennedy assassination, and he's been isolated from being able to tell his participation, or doesn't want to because he'll be killed in jail. But the same way Gerald Ford's office with Mr. Cheney as his chief of staff those guys believed that the assassinations in this country should never come out. There are court cases in Texas and judges and now FBI director who could open up these cases but believe quite openly, probably just like Gerald Ford said, that you don't have to know. These matters are too important for you to know. Now, Jim Mars is a long rider from Dallas, Texas, an investigator, and he said Charles V. Harrelson, a contracted hitman who recently was charged with the slaying of federal judge John Wood in San Antonio on May 29, 1979, has admitted he participated in the Kennedy assassination. I keep referring to the Christic Institute suit that was filed May 29, 1986, and Judge Wood was murdered May 29, 1979, and there's a lot in common between the drug dealers that are involved in the Christic Institute suit and the drug dealers, specifically Edwin Wilson and the persons that took weapons from China Lake, that I'll develop for you, and I admit it's complicated, but there are direct linkages, or maybe I'll have to chart it out with diagrams to show you the links of the persons who killed Judge Wood with William Sessions sitting on the lid of it, and yet they connect to the current-day Christic Institute persons who are named in the suit and participated. Edwin Wilson isn't in the suit, but Theodore Shackley is and Thomas Klein's, and these people had that same continuity that has been named in the Christic affidavit, going back to the Bay of Pigs operations or to the hiring that Robert Mayu did in 1960, prior to the Bay of Pigs, of assassination teams. Harrelson was arrested September the 1st, 1980. The judge was killed May 29th. September the 1st, 1980, he was high on drugs, allegedly with a pistol in his hand. At that time, Harrelson confessed to the Judge Wood assassination. He said he did it, and he also participated in the Kennedy assassination. There were 3 tramps taken away by the police near Dealey Plaza minutes after Kennedy was killed. I'm reading the Jim Mars article from the Dallas News Tribune. 3 men were taken away. Lee Bowers saw 3 men sneak into an empty railroad car right after the assassination in the Union Rail Yards just behind the Texas School Book Depository. Moments after the assassination, the train was halted when it started to move. Bowers summoned the Dallas police. The 3 were taken at gunpoint, marched to the Dallas Sheriff's Office. Once in Dallas police custody, the men disappeared. No fingerprints taken, names taken, ever made public. Now, of the 3 tramps that were in Dealey Plaza, and Jim Mars notes that they weren't tramps, they were well-dressed, a little disheveled when they were picked up, but definitely not tramps. One of them is referred to as Frenchie, and he was behind the fence in the railroad yard there and picked up along with a man that could be Charles Harrelson. And Frenchie, the same man, was identified in the area around the Lorraine Motel when Martin Luther King was killed. And Frenchie is tied into the coup in France that almost took place when the arrangements were made to kill Charles de Gaulle. And this is the coup of the colonels that they planned because de Gaulle gave Algeria their freedom. And I want to update the coup of the colonels with Oliver North attempting these operations and the relationship of the attempted coups in France, the colonels from Algeria, Frenchmen who fought in Algeria and tried to kill Charles de Gaulle, to the murder of John Kennedy. But one of the men at the tramps at Dealey Plaza could be Charles Harrelson. He wanted to talk, and the time is running out now, so I'll have to continue with our new FBI director, William Sessions, and what he didn't do at the trial of Judge Wood, and how he and FBI Director Webster, who's now our CIA director, are controlling these operations and investigations. And, of course, Gerald Ford and Mr. Cheney, Representative Cheney, who was on the Iran-Contra affair hearings, the Intelligence Committee, keep a lid on these investigations. There's a continuity of people through the years who've kept the secrets on the Kennedy assassination, such as Gerald Ford, on the Warren Commission, and then citing the Rockefeller Commission's right to secrecy. And the coup lines are strong, and the new FBI director, Sessions, sat on this story, the real story of who killed Judge Wood. As I say, our time is up, and I hoped to do a complete part on that, but I'll have to do it next week. But I think you get the idea that I'm trying to say about the linkage through Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King's assassinations, and also the law enforcement people who are put on as judges, such as William Sessions, by Richard Nixon, who was in Dallas, by Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission, then became president, and they are pushing William Sessions to go now from Texas to Washington to be in charge of all of our law enforcement, and with John Tower pushing this nomination also. And we have to get a little historical perspective, or hysterical, whichever way you feel, about the new FBI director. This is Mae Brussell. There's just so much news. We run through this pretty fast. I do with you. I hope it connects. You remember some of these names. I'll be back with you next week to continue. Hopefully begin right away with some more on William Sessions, our new FBI director.